Sort of like what we see beneath us here in this video. Figured it'd actually be a good opportunity to demonstrate something through what we see in the frame. I say the frame because I intend to keep this still for the duration of this recording. Well, here we are. Here we are again. So, let's talk a little bit about the cycle. The cycle that a lot of us will end up following and going into if we don't actually change our mindset. If you don't perform the inner work. Because, and I just moved the frame. So if you perform the inner work, you can actually change your subconscious core programming and you can have continuous and steady gains. You're not going to necessarily have all these ups and downs that you would if, for instance, you ended up just casting, these little works, doing these operations and these performing the arts, these performances, these ceremonies, these rituals. Even with the affirmations, look, there's a lot of people that do affirmations that, you know, they might do it for maybe, once a day. I don't know, once a day for 30 minutes a day. And during those, 30 minutes or so time span that they're doing it, give or take, whatever kind of got them into the idea of doing the affirmations. And then, however they feel momentarily right after doing said affirmations, and then going back to just doing the same old stuff over and over again that they've already been doing, well, it should come as no surprise that, they just end up following these same old cycles. Because we had talked about in a previous video of ours that we had just uploaded. Well, I had just uploaded it and you watched it. I talked about how a lot of people that will get into guitar will do so in a scarcity mindset. And a lot of time, that scarcity mindset ends up entailing getting yourself into a contract out of desperation. To which, I'm going to be honest with you, dealing with the other planes, the other realms, and the entities in other realms, it's not as simple as, you got yourself into some bit of a bind here. You're either just gonna, find a way to get your way out of it, whether that's through some kind of, tricks and trades and, moving some money here and there. When it comes to dealing with entities on the other realms and the other planes, yeah, no, sometimes, well, if you fuck around, you find out. And it's more common than you think. I mean, look, I used to be in, a bit of a situation where I'll just say I was desperate. I did some things out of desperation. And I'm still paying for it. Because one, I did sign some dotted lines, both, physically and metaphorically. I signed some dotted lines with the government. Yup. The old explainer here was being explained to by Uncle Sam and some guys with big brown hats were explaining things to the explainer when I was younger. I remember those days. And, I paid the price. I got my ass kicked. And, mind you, I still get my ass kicked from time to time. That's part of what it entails. But I've also, gone on the journey of learning more. Now, it doesn't matter that I've learned a lot more. Well, I already bought myself into that ticket. So, I bought myself the ticket and I entered into the contract. So, if I fuck myself up, well, then I fuck myself up. And so, if some Christian zealot or someone's trying to convert you, saying all you got to do is repent, invoke Jesus, and he'll help you out. You don't got to follow these contracts anymore. Yeah, I mean, who do you think's the one that helps you get into these contracts? Who do you think's the one that made all these, spirits, entities, beings? Well, it's, the Lord, the Father. He made all this stuff to begin with. He's the one that, made all these possible contracts you can get yourself into. Yeah, no, it's not that simple. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not an option, although I'm just saying if you take that option, there's a very high likelihood of some serious ass kicking. Like, I'm just saying it happened to me, okay? Speaking from experience here, in the experiences of people that I've met and I've known. Now, another thing that I decided I want to talk about is the narcissistic behavior that you see going on these days. And I think Tucker Carlson and some other guy, they had an amazing show about, talking about narcissism. I know Frederick Xavier and Chris Hedges did as well. And, after looking into it, and this is not medical advice, by the way, this is in no way, shape, or form medical advice or medical education. This is just, based off of what I've seen and heard. You know, the narcissism has kind of these cycles. You go from vulnerable to grandiose because ultimately narcissism is, in its popular context, well, that's just a scarcity mindset. And I think I actually saw it in a video just recently, that, narcissists want to have control. That's ultimately what they desire. And what, as we all do, nothing lasts forever. Everything has its cycles. Everything has its ups and downs. However, a lot of the narcissism that you see going on today, you really start to see it get ugly. You really start to see it get ugly when they lose control. It's where all these these concepts come from. Yeah. These narcissists begin to lose control and that's when, they start lashing out. That's where the whole okay boomer and okay Karen things go. The okay this and the okay that. You know, it's same thing. You hear about the story of, the nerd that got shoved in the wall locker all the time and he got his ass kicked all the time. And it turns out said nerd that got shoved in the wall locker is now running the world. This nerd is running some multi-million dollar, company or whatever, multi-billion dollar with a B. That's a B as in boy and Bravo. Oh yeah, he's running this company and now he's just treating everyone else like shit. I mean, you see a lot of things of you're seeing so many symptoms of scarcity nowadays. From just the excessive control that those in power are trying to have and maintain. I mean, really, that screams scarcity to me, at least. I mean, to anyone that has watched this channel for any amount of time, especially if you watch other stuff, because if you found my channel, there's a pretty good chance you've been exposed to some other stuff before you found my channel. And if I am your first foray into, the arts and the philosophies to Hermetic philosophy, well, then, hey, congratulations. Welcome abroad. Welcome aboard. And, you know, enjoy the ride. But in all seriousness, the narcissism that you see going on these days, it's no different than, if you heard about the story of, the hot girl in school, the hot chick, she gets older and the guys don't want her anymore, or the guys do want her, but they don't really put her up on the pedestal like they used to. She can't get, the handsome, tall, and rich guy like she could, 10 or 20 years ago. Now she's all mad. Well, that's the scarcity coming out. This same scarcity mindset applies to everything. This is sort of, a lot of people, they get themselves into these arts and they start learning this philosophy, and well, they've gotten the pearls and they're swine. They haven't really changed their mindset yet. They haven't really done the inner work, the theurgy, and, the integration with that divine consciousness yet, the Christ consciousness. I mean, they haven't done it yet. So, now you see where all this stuff is turning to shit these days. I mean, there's just so many things being inverted nowadays. It's wow, a few years ago, my mind was totally blown. I was knocked on my ass, knocked off my feet. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I've I've done some things to deserve what I get. Well, we all do things to deserve what we get, and we all deserve what we get. If you believe in reincarnation and that, whatever you have now is, just a continuation of what carried over from a past life, well, then I guess you have no right to complain. But, you see these cycles, and narcissism is just a perfect example of it. You see the night cycles of, you know, the vulnerability or the grandiosity, when they do have their control and they are getting their way. Oh yeah, things can be real nice. Things can be real swell and easy going. Except for those of us that are, I guess for those of us that have the awareness. And, I think Hidden America did a rant too. Or maybe it was Hyperborean Knowledge, I don't remember. But they talked about, the price of knowledge. Hyperborean knowledge, he talks about that too. In fact, I know he talked about that too. I r- recall it was at least one of them. Hidden American Hyperborean knowledge. Man, I really got to start actually dropping some links and plugging these folks. There's a lot of stuff for me to learn, and I have countless hours on this channel. Not to mention all the stuff that I've talked about in all these other channels and platforms that I'm using. Oh yeah, that could easily amount to thousands. And as far as my, grimoires go and everything else, well, I've given you a sneak peek, but I can't just be giving away everything at once. No, it's a little more than that. And look, I know that I'm tired here. I know it's not an excuse, but we got to power through this. So, as far as the narcissism, it's just such a clear cut example. It's just so obvious. He mentioned that the price of knowledge is, well, it's the fact that you're too aware. Everything has to go through the subconscious. Whether you're going up to Keter or down to Malkut, you're going to have to go through Yesod and the infernal triangle. And, Dot, the abyss, connecting Binah and, Pogma to, the middle pillar, the rest of the middle pillar. If, for some of you, I know you don't really, Keter and Malkut aren't really the tree of life, they're the fruit. All right, guys, we don't need to get into all the technicalities here. Well, you're going to have to go through Yesod and the infernal triangle, so that means too much consciousness, too much of that aware, you know, right hand energy. The energy of mercy is, well, you're not really letting it out of the way. It's just always in there. That's why sometimes, if you do the affirmations, it can take about, you know, 10,000 tries, 100,000 hours. It's because eventually it's going to slip into the subconscious with enough force. But you got Dot there just standing in the way. And that's also part of the reason why on the middle pillar and the unicursal hexagram, Binah is closer to Dot than Dot is to Hokmah. That's why for Dot it says, Yod He Vav He Elohim. That's actually Binah. But no, Binah is close to Dot. That's also why. It's also when you do the Saturn banishing ritual of the hexagram, you're going up to Dot. You're going upwards, to the top. You're not going to Keter. No, you're going to Dot. Just a little pointer out there, for those of you that are, interested in Thelema or the Golden Dawn, which, in my opinion, the Golden Dawn system has some great stuff to offer. In fact, the lesser ritual of the hexagram, the lesser ritual of the pentagram, and the middle pillar are all great. Although, for the hexagram, it can be a little overpowering sometimes. That's why even I use it very sparingly. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you what I do, but I'm just going to tell you what I don't do excessively. That's part of it, the sign of silence. But, a good sign of narcissism is, well, it's, this need for control. That's scarcity. That's a scarcity mindset. And that scarcity mindset, well, that's vulnerability right there. You ever heard the saying that, dogs and wolves, they can smell fear? Yeah, they can smell the scarcity. Because, in the mythology, Zeus, Zeus kicks Kronos' ass into Tartarus after Zeus, snips his own dad and then tries to eat his own children. Zeus managed to get away. And well, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. That's where, Sirius and Procyon are. That's where the sign of Canis is. I mean, not the sign, but, the constellation of Canis Major is. It's all there. Cancer, fourth house, Hesed. I mean, what else is there? There's, Jupiter exalted in Cancer, the dog, dogs, wolves, they can smell fear. They're very pack animals, very loyal. They howl at the moon. They have strength in numbers. There you go. And I also decided I was going to add a little tidbit, although this is going to be for another video, about, what happens when you have too much mercy in your life. Too much mercy being, well, that mercy being the pillar of mercy. You end up kind of being like Pisces. You got all this stuff going on, but you don't really have anywhere to go for it. Because, if you want something to get done faster, well, you actually have to operate in the physical realm. That's also part of why, Geburah and Hod are under Binah. They are in the pillar of severity. Geburah, that's Mars, that's movement, action. And Mercury, that's, analytical Hod. So with Mars, Geburah, well, I mean, in order to move, you have to destroy something. In order for me to talk here, I have to, you know, take that oxygen in, burn it up, and exhale it into carbon dioxide as I'm talking. I have to burn calories, and you have to work within the physical realm. That physical realm having gravity and, the other laws of nature, decay, entropy. Same thing with, you know, Mercury. Mercury, that's Hod. Oh, you the Sephiroth of Hod, well, that's corresponds with, the mind, analytical. Well, if you're analyzing and if you're coming up with equations, there's a saying why, there's 1,000 ways to do things wrong, but, typically there's only a handful of ways to do things right. So, there you go. You're getting rid of the wrong and you're, in order to find the right. Also, for a little quick tidbit, brain burns a lot of calories. There's once again that action of Mars, that burning, that destruction. In order to move, you have to destroy something. Whether that's, burning the calories that you've eaten today, burning the gas in your car, if you're running or if you're, doing some really intense exercise, you can be breaking down your muscles, causing little fractures in your bones. And if you're trying to push something out of the way, or if it's really stuck to the ground or whatever, bolt it down, you're going to need a little bit of extra force. That'll be it.